interestingly enough, con artists took money from people in order to see the fairy queen. But they only took money from people in the bourgeois or middle-class citizens of urban centers because they didn't know better. They thought that there might be fairies. So that's kind of the end of my talk. But I just want to leave you with this beautiful book that I got, a Flower Fairies Journal. These are not the same fairies. They're not fairies from the 19th century. The 19th century was fascinated by fairies. Why were they so interested in fairies, and what kind of fairies? Very small fairies, fairies that, let's see, what does this mean? This is a flower fairy. It's been such a whirlwind of activity. Dulcie and I have had the time of our lives, spending our days swimming and cycling and hiking, and inspired. So this is an imaginative fairy. But they're all pretty, and they're all small. They're not dangerous. They're children's fairies. 16th century fairies were not for children. So, thoughts? Fairies from your perspective? Any fairy stories?
I have a question about this term changeling. Because I have a degree in history also, and I read a lot of English and Scottish history, and I just read a novel called The Winter Sea, which has to do with the exile of King James and bringing him back to Scotland. And it reminded me how often when I read English history, pretenders to the thrones are called changeling. When historians use the term changeling, are they referring to this fairy?
I don't know. Studying historians, I don't know.
Yeah. Because the term is used so many, I mean, there have been so many pretenders to the thrones and bastard and illegitimate children who claim the thrones, and so often that the use of the term changeling is used, and I've always wondered about that.
I think literally, changeling just means a baby that has been exchanged.
Okay.
So a fairy changeling would be a baby exchanged by fairies.
Okay.
But I think in this circumstance, it sounds like a baby that is not the original baby.
Lower class, yes. Usually an illegitimate. One of the Kate's mistresses has the baby, and he very often engages in rebellion, has his supporters, and very often in the absence of a legitimate heir to the throne, the changeling will try to secure that position. So that the use of the term changeling has always intrigued me, and the application of the fairies here it just kind of caught my interest. I don't know how related that is to fairies.
No, absolutely. So changeling had other meanings too. But there might have been some feeling of trespass. Because when you say fairy in the early 17th century, there's a sense of something illicit. So when they said changeling, maybe there still was not that they were fairies, but there was a sense of the illicit, the trespass. There's something not quite right going on.
But then again, coming back to the meaning here in The Winter's Tale, we've got the use of the term changeling in place of a
bastard. Sounds better than bastard.
Something that really interesting that got my attention when you were talking is when I was doing some research on Puck and Robin Goodfellow, I learned from like the history and how it got to the character that we know today, that it wasn't until this period that the Buka and the other type of pixies were considered to be childlike. And so when you're telling me about how, and then it was used to explain all these illegitimate children, it makes so much sense of why the image of them became this changeling child.
I think there were applications of fairies in mines too, were there not?
Yeah, when the Cornish miners came to America, they brought with them their lore of the fairies that protected them in the mines, which became the Tommyknockers, which people believed around here for a while.
Peter Narvaez did an anthology of essays reports from people from Ireland primarily, I think from Wales also. And there was an Irish woman who talked about how her mother had convinced her that there was a fairy by this river, and not to go near the river because she could be abducted by the fairies. Because she had other children, and she couldn't always watch over her child, So she wanted to make sure that this child did not go by the river. So she invented a problem. She invented the ferry for a very reasonable purpose, which had nothing actually to do with fairies, but worked for her. She did not go near the river, not because she was afraid of drowning, but because she was afraid of the ferry that could help.
How did the church look on this, the whole folklore of fairies? I mean, I realize we're fairies to a mother who had lost a baby. It would be a comfort to think that it was still living among the fairies, or to some young girl, instead of saying, you're just a tramp and in trouble, that it was the fairies. I mean, it softened a lot of blows that they had in their lives. But how did the church look on it?
Thomas Hobbes. Well, the church, it depends on which church. There are many churches, many local churches. And I'm sure that there's a lot of local differences. The Welsh churches probably had fairies, sketched, I don't know. The Welsh churches probably were totally bought into this as members of the community. But the Puritan churches believed anything that was not from God was from the devil. And there's a quote from Thomas Hobbes saying, the real father of fairies is Beelzebub. That's the only father of fairies. Because if they're not human, then they're satanic. And so I would suspect, although as an historian I'd want you to check me out on this, that the Catholic Church was probably quite comfortable, and the increasingly reformist or Puritan Church was probably quite uncomfortable if we were to do a binary. Because the Catholic Church also believed in the possibility of angels, I believe, and believed in, the Protestant, at least the strict reformist Protestants did not believe in angels. The Catholic Church would believe in some saints, and so I think there probably was some variation. That was another problem that the Puritans had with fairies, was that the thought was that this was superstition that came from the previous era, and this previous era, which wasn't all that previous under Mary Tudor, right? Their grandparents' memory, right? And so anything that came from the previous era smacked of Catholicism, and they did what they could to stamp it out. So fairies and fairy belief had some political juice too, some political meanings and implications also.
I know that one interesting explanation for fairies is that they're the souls of unbaptized children. So I don't know when that came out, or if that may have been the kind of Catholic look on it.
I think it might be. That's a good point. You don't want to say your baby went to hell. Better if they were baptized.
Another interesting thing about the Puck and the Buka is, from all my research, that they, unlike most unworldly things, they have things that ward them off. Vampires with garlic, werewolves, silver bullets, and they go through a whole list. Everyone has one. But the fairies do not. The only way in all of the lore that I found to keep the fairies from bothering you is to stay on their good sides. So, people leave a little food out for the fairies and all stuff like that. And so if you think about how much of the lore that we've studied today comes about with these kind of half-breeds, part human, part fairy, and that kind of usually things that are of both worlds tend to be immune to the weapons of each world. So that's really interesting.
And the question was, who eats, who drinks the milk, right? And we still leave out milk for Santa Claus. And cookies. So who eats the milk and cookies? There's always someone who eats the milk and cookies. There's always some human, so that's always the question. So what is the real reason